Hello, and welcome back to the Mechanochemistry discussions. This seminar series is hosted by the NSF-funded Center for Mechanical Control of Chemistry, or the CMCC. I'm Ashley Martini. The goal of the seminar series is to bring the community together. Our seminars stream live on the third Thursday of every month at 10 a.m. Central and are available to watch anytime on the YouTube channel. We've had many excellent speakers as part of this seminar series, and I encourage you to check them all out. We also have a few excellent speakers in the upcoming months, and we hope that you will join us for these as well. Before we get started, a great big thanks to a few people. First, Dr. James Batiste, the Center Director, Jennifer Belsick, the Center's Administrative Coordinator, and two CMCC students who helped with the coordination of the seminar, Noah Sheehan and Quintarius Moore. Thank you so much ahead of time for joining us. Please do follow us on Twitter and on YouTube for all of our future seminars and other news. Quick notes, this seminar is being recorded. If you have questions for the speaker, please either email them to us at cmccdiscussions@gmail.com or post them in YouTube, and they will be propagated to the speaker to be answered at the end of the seminar. Finally, it's my pleasure to welcome today's speaker, Dr. Jonathan Feltz. Dr. Feltz earned his bachelor's in mechanical engineering from Georgia Institute of Technology in 2008. He received his master's from Illinois in 2009 and was awarded his PhD under the advisement of Professor William P. King for work on tip-based nanomanufacturing and nanometrology of chemical nanostructures. He was the recipient of the Eugene and Lena Abraham Endowed PhD Fellowship in the Department of Energy Office of Science Graduate Fellowship during his PhD studies. He was awarded a National Academy of Science National Research Council postdoctoral fellowship at the Naval Research Laboratory, and he joined the faculty at Texas A&M in 2014, becoming tenured in 2020. Dr. Feltz is the recipient of a 2019 NSF Career Award, is a member of Pi Tau Sigma and Tau Beta Pi Honor Societies, and has authored or co-authored 36 peer-reviewed journal articles and has 2 patents. His current research interests lie at the intersection of chemistry, mechanics, and physics to alter transport and reactivity. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Jonathan Feltz.
All right, thank you for that introduction. I'm Dr. Jonathan Feltz, a professor of mechanical engineering at Texas A&M University. And today I'm going to talk about some of the efforts that I've been pursuing with a number of people in the pursuit of trying to create experiments to quantify mechanochemical reactions at interfaces. And most of the work that I'm going to show you today is centered around atomic force microscopy, and I'll talk a little bit about where I think it should be headed or could be headed in the future. So let's get started. So if anyone's been to the Center for Mechanical Control of Chemistry website, they've probably seen this image. And we consider this to be one of the grand challenges of mechanochemistry today, where we go from the atomic scale here on the right, where we have a pretty good theoretical understanding of how forces drive reactions, and in terms of thermodynamics and kinetics. But how do we take that all the way from the atomic scale up to the macroscale synthesis, where product yield and selectivity are largely determined experimentally, sort of empirically, with little connection between the fundamental thermodynamics and kinetics to that product yield and selectivity. And so most of the work that I'm going to talk about today kind of fits between C and D, where we are developing tools and techniques to measure some of these atomic and nanoscale fundamental thermodynamics and kinetics of these reactions, with which we would like to slowly build on over time. So the first question, of course, which is the big question that hopefully I will convince you is possible today, is can we quantitatively measure force-dependent reactions at the nanoscale? And before we measure it, we have to think about what is it that we're measuring. So I'll very briefly go through the fundamental framework with which we understand these reactions. Before I do that, for those of you who don't know what an atomic force microscope is, It's basically a really tiny record player. So you have a micro cantilever, and at the end of the cantilever, there's a sharp nanoscale tip, and you can drag this tip around on a surface. And when the cantilever bends, you can measure how much that cantilever bends. And importantly, if you look here on the left, you can see if it's sliding left and right, it'll twist, right? And so you can measure that twist. And so you can measure friction. That's one measurement you can make. And if you look here on the right, if you push down, it'll bend, and this measurement is vertical, so you can measure the normal force. So one important thing, and we'll come back to this later on, is that you can use this AFM tip to measure both normal loads and shear loads on a surface. Okay, so the quick and dirty way that we think about mechanochemical reactions. If you think about any complex chemical reaction, we think about it in terms of jumping between states. And so you have some initial state, and if you want to get over here, you got to jump over some energy barriers to get to that state. And typically, the energy with which that is given to this to jump those barriers is thermal energy, right? But you can also apply mechanical energy, and mechanical energy distorts this pathway in a distinct way. So if we think about just some random made-up molecule, apologies, I'm a mechanical engineer moonlighting as a chemist, so this doesn't look like probably anything interesting to you all, but it's just to demonstrate the concept. If this is your starting reactant, and this is the transition to go from bonded to unbonded, then you can think about the thermal energy is applying, random kinetic oscillations of this bond. And if you apply a force in the direction of the reaction or along the reaction coordinate, then you will drive that reaction forward with that force. And then not shown here, if the force is going the other way, you can retard that reaction, or if it's going sideways, it might have no impact or minimal impact. And if you, excuse me, and if you look over here on the right, hopefully to most of the chemists in the audience, this will look very familiar. This is just an Arrhenius reaction, but I've added in this term, which is just some random function that is a function of force, right? And so the way to think about this is we can drop this thermal energy barrier through the application of force, assuming the force is along that reaction coordinate. And some interesting things can happen. So theoretically, if you want to drop energy with force, it's force over some distance, right? That's work, right? And so the distance over which that occurs is from the initial state over the transition barrier. And what's interesting is as you start applying force to this really simple energy barrier, the whole landscape sort of shifts down, right? And so not only are you lowering that barrier, you're also shortening the distance over which that reaction has to travel, right? The distance, right? And I'll talk about that a little bit in a minute. Okay, so this is sort of the basic way that we think about how forces can alter this energy landscape to drive reactions. Importantly, force has a direction, right? The direction matters. And we'll get back to that as well. Okay, so this function of force, what is it, right? Well, if you ignore the stiffness of these reaction and transition states, right? If you just assume that all you're doing is lowering the barrier, then you could just think about it in the simplest form of work. You apply some force to this atom or to this bond, and the reaction coordinate distance over which that has to travel to get to the transition state is the amount of work that force is applying, right? Force times distance work. Alternatively, another way to think about it, is the pressure or the stress that you apply to the atom or to the molecular system times this is actually a typo, it's not the volume, it's the change in volume between the reactant state and the transition state, also gives you work. It's pressure times change in volume, right? Both of these are used in different situations, right? So a lot of times we'll talk about it if you're stretching a bond. It makes sense to think about it in terms of a distance. If you're pushing two complex three-dimensional molecules together to react them, it might be simpler to think about it in terms of a volume. Both of them are sort of approximations of something in between, right? So these are sometimes used somewhat interchangeably. So if we go back to this idea that the curvature and the stiffness of this potential energy landscape can change, there can be some extra terms can show up in here. So because we're shortening that reaction coordinate, you can get some higher order terms. So let's look at that a little bit more. So I just put together a simple looking type of landscape. And what I'm doing is I'm applying a force to this landscape along the reaction coordinate. And what's happening, you can see these solid black. So the dotted lines are the initial reactant coordinate and the transition state, right? And as I push them, right, the energy barrier lowers and the distance lowers. And so if you look at how this energy barrier changes with the applied force, you can see that the dotted line here on the right is this linear approximation I talked about, force times delta x. But as you continue to push these two states closer together, the reaction barrier actually sort of slows down a little bit and takes on that slight distance squared effect or force squared effect. And here in this example, it looks slight, but depending on the shape of the surface, it can be quite dramatic, okay? So that's sort of the theory by which we think about how force drives these reactions. Another really important question, because force is a magnitude and a vector, can we decouple the different force components, right? If we push on it one way, is that the same as pushing on it in a different way? And so if we can start to actually independently control these things, we can look at some really interesting, fundamental mechanics of these chemical reactions. Okay, and the way that I'm going to exploit this in this talk, I'm not going to go into much detail here, but essentially all you need to know for this discussion is that at the nanoscale, low enough forces and low enough speeds, the friction force applied by this AFM tip can be much different depending on the speed, right? So if you look over here on the left, let's just pick one of these curves, right? So this is one curve. This is apply one normal load, so a constant normal load. You can vary the speed by, or you could vary the lateral force or the friction force by not quite double, about 50% or so, which is enough to get us some interesting things, right? So this, using speed, we can independently tune friction force as a function of normal force, okay? And so this is an important concept with which to understand some of what I'm going to be talking about today. Okay, so enough of the background and the theory. Let's get into some of the experiments that we've developed over the years to allow us to start to measure some of these mechanochemical reactions at surfaces. All right, so one of the systems that we utilize heavily is graphene. We are interested in graphene for slightly a different reason than most people. Most people think about graphene as a electronic material or in some cases a photonic material. We are just interested in it for this work primarily because it provides us a very well-defined chemical makeup, right? So I can put bonds on this two-dimensional material, and I know which direction the bonds are pointing. I can use that as a reference relative to the direction that the forces that I'm applying are being applied, right? So this gives me a very well-defined system with which to apply forces along a known coordinate, right? So what we like to do is we like to modify this graphene. We could, the most common one is oxygen. We've also looked at fluorine, and to some extent hydrogen as well, but you can put a lot of different things on this on graphene and you can do reactions with it. The primary way that we initially started looking at how these mechanochemical reactions occurs, we started really simple. We said, how much force does it take to remove the oxygen from the graphene, right? So we're bond breaking, which is much less interesting to the synthetic chemists that are watching today, but I'll make some bonds later. Okay, so stick with me. And the way that we measure the bond breaking is we look at the change in friction. So we know that whenever we bond something to graphene, the friction rises dramatically. And so as we're removing whatever it was that we put on there, the friction drops. And this friction drops, I don't have the information here, but we looked pretty closely, and the friction does appear to drop roughly linearly with the concentration of whatever it is that you put on the graphene. you can kind of see here that we can control the friction drop, from 100 to down to 20%, based on, the load and the time at which we scan. Okay. So here's an example of that on graphene oxide. So unfortunately, there's not a color bar, so I apologize, but orange is high friction, dark purple is low friction. And so what we're doing here is we're making a scan on the inside at very high force to drive the removal of the oxygen species on the surface. And then we do a larger scan at a lower force to measure the difference in friction between the outside and the inside. And what's really interesting is this graphene was oxidized using an oxygen plasma. And you can actually see that there were some dirt and other junk on the surface when we oxidized this graphene, and then the dirt was subsequently removed. So you see these little purple dots around this square. That's actually pristine graphene. So you can see that we're able to remove nearly all of the oxygen that we had placed on the surface. And there's a drop in height of about 3 angstroms, which is roughly in line with what we would expect. Okay. So here's some of the results. These experiments take quite a bit of time. So this data is, and as we'll go along, this data starts to get progressively more intense, sometimes being many gigabytes of data for one curve. But what you can see here on the left is this is the change in friction over time as a function of the applied normal load. So you can see in the back, this is a low applied load of 25 nanonewtons. Okay. And then as we increase the load, 50, 75, 100, and continue on, the rate at which this drops increases quite significantly, and then seems to sort of flatten out here a little bit. Okay. And so what we can do is we could take each one of those curves and we can fit a first order, assume a first order reaction. We can fit that curve for each one of these forces and pull out a reaction rate as a function now of force. So now we have a reaction rate as a function of contact stress. Now, this is great. This is quantitative. We didn't want to cheat, so we put our error bars on the x-axis as well. The contact stress that you're applying at that interface has a lot of uncertainty in it because the tip radius is so small that minor changes in the tip radius while you're scanning can increase your uncertainty quite a bit. But nevertheless, it still does appear to roughly be an exponential relationship versus a linear relationship, which is a little bit sort of what we would expect. So if we come back to the theory of mechanochemical reactions, right? If we look at this and assume it's if the force linearly reduces this barrier, right, just force times distance or stress times change in volume, right? So we can pull out some fitting parameters and we can come up with this activation volume, this delta V here, of around 11 or so angstroms cubed, which is sort of in line with the volume of these epoxide and hydroxyls that they take on the surface, the oxygen groups. And we can also guess at an activation energy, and I stress guess. If you look at this equation, we have this K naught. We have to assume an attempt frequency. How many times per second is this reaction attempting to occur, right? It tends to be 10 to the 11 to 10 to the 15 in solid systems, which is quite large. We pick something in the middle. We get about 0.7 EV, right? Obviously, there's a lot of work to be done here, but this was very interesting to us because it showed us that we could take these very quantitative measurements of single atom thick reactions. Okay, so let's expand on this a little bit. So if you look down here in the bottom right, you see I have now highlighted temperature. Right, this is the other knob we haven't turned yet. And so we wanted to start turning that knob because we want to understand how does force and temperature play together to drive these reactions. And so the primary tool that we use to study these reactions are heated atomic force microscope cantilevers. And they're not very complicated. They simply work like a light bulb. Okay, so you have two legs. They're doped, so they're highly conductive. Then you have this low conductivity region where most of the heat is dissipated. Okay, high resistance, a lot of heat dissipated. And then right there on the end, if you zoom in over here on the right there on the end is our little nanometer sized tip that's touching the surface and taking measurements. And so if you look at an IR image of this entire microcantilever, you can see that the heat is localized to this area, but it's much larger than, a nanometer, right? So you think, well, how could you possibly localize this massive heater down to a small nanoscale region? And the reason is that the air gap in between, this a micron-sized air gap in between the heater and the surface drops the temperature of the environment dramatically, such that most of the temperature rise, so most of the heat is flowing from the legs to the surface, but most of the temperature rise is localized to that contact. And so you can get thermal temperature excursions isolated to roughly 100 nanometers or less, right? So 10 to 50 nanometers. Okay, so we use this on this similar type of surface to see if we can redo these measurements looking at both force and temperature at the same time. So here we're again using graphene oxide, and we use both temperature and force simultaneously to drop the friction, and which tells us the removal rate over time. Okay, and so the strategy is very similar to the strategy that we conducted with just force, where now we've added the additional knob of temperature. So when we're scanning on the inside, that tiny area where we apply the load we're interested in to drive the reaction and the temperature. And then when we scan on the outside, we're using a cool tip at low forces so that we can measure the difference between what we processed and what is occurring in the outside region. Okay. It's important, I get this question a lot, so I'll answer it now. It's important that the temperature is localized so that the reaction isn't occurring when we're not pushing, okay? And so that's one of the reasons why we have to use these localized heaters, okay? So if we do this, the first thing we tried was, okay, let's set it at a given load and a given temperature, and let's just keep doing this process to find how the friction drops over time at a given temperature. You can see over here on the left, we did this for temperatures of between 310 Celsius up to 355 Celsius. Now, for those who've worked with graphene oxide and have thermally reduced it, you might ask yourself, why did we go so high? Well, it's all about the thermal dose, right? It's temperature, but also time, right? And because the temperature is localized to this very small heat source, the cumulative time at which it's at that temperature is actually fairly small. And so you have to go to higher temperatures to actually see the reaction occurring on a reasonable time scale. Okay, and we can fit our first order reactions as we did before with just the mechanical force, and we can plot rate as a function of temperature. And what we find over here on the right is a little bit underwhelming, right? You see, okay, it's clearly kind of looks sort of flat here, and then it rises as we get to higher temperatures. So maybe that's exponential. We can fit exponential models to it. And we get an activation energy of 0.7, which kind of matches our guess from the old study. So that's good, but plus or minus 0.3. So that's kind of bad, right? I mean, think about how many how many reactions can occur within that range. That's not terribly helpful. And so we thought to ourselves, this experiment here probably took about a week of AFM scanning straight, and the results were kind of lackluster. So we thought to ourselves, how can we speed this process up? And we took a play from the materials community doing something very similar to, say, thermogravimetry, where instead of doing a bunch of different experiments at a bunch of different temperatures, what if we linearly ramp the temperature while doing this measurement so we can get some measure of the effective rate at all temperatures, okay? And so that's what you're seeing here experimentally. On the left is the drop in friction and the friction measurements, right? And on the right shows you how that drop in friction occurs as we are linearly increasing the temperature. And so you can see at low temperatures, nothing's really happening. But then once we reach a certain temperature level, we start to see a dramatic drop in friction until we've removed most of what we're removing, and then we go back to roughly flat again, okay? So this gave us somewhat nicer results. So there's lots of different ways to try to fit the differential equation that incorporates this linear increase in temperature. It's not really possible to solve it explicitly. So there are a lot of there are a lot of simplified versions of solutions that people use. We just used Coates and Redfern from 1964. That seemed to work as well as any of the others. What we found was an activation energy of about 0.62 plus or minus 0.07. So much better, much better errors here, and the data took less time to gather, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, so we finally felt confident that we had a decent method to measure the reaction rate as a function of temperature. And so now let's look at it as a function of load, right? So that's what we wanted to do. That's why we put this whole experiment together. We can look at the effect of temperature and load together at the same time. And so if you notice here on the left, this was our original curve that I just showed you. This was done at relatively low loads of 40 nanonewtons, and this drops off. You have to get above about 300 C before things start to significantly drop off, which is consistent with the data that I showed you before at constant temperature measurements. As we start raising the load, the temperature at which this reaction starts occurring starts to drop, and it starts to drop fairly significantly. You can see even here at 320 nanonewtons, which is pretty high for this system, we're seeing it drop pretty much immediately, right? So this is the point at which the mechanical load starts to sort of overpower the thermal load, or the point at which the barrier becomes pretty negligible. But what's interesting is we can fit our models to this data, and we can pull out an activation energy as a function of force. And so here is the force that we're applying. And what we can see is that indeed the force, again, there's some error here in the x-axis, but it looks like the force isn't quite linear, and it seems to be tailing off a little bit, kind of like we might expect from this Hammond postulate or the extended bell theory. And so this was an interesting finding for us to see that, hey, you can actually experimentally observe whether or not this drop in energy is linear with force or not. And so we were pretty excited about that work. Okay, so I promised you earlier on that we were also going to talk about making bonds, right? Not just breaking bonds. So again, the bonds I'm going to make, maybe I oversold it. They're not super dramatic. We're going to do the opposite reaction of what we just did. Instead of breaking oxygen copper or oxygen carbon bonds here, we're going to make them. And the way that we make them using our AFM tip is using electrochemistry. So if you take one of these AFM tips and you make them conductive so that they can conduct electricity, when you put this AFM tip in contact with a surface, because of the curvature of this system, water from the atmosphere will naturally condense around the tip. And so what you have is this little tiny electrochemical reactor where you can run redox reactions with water against the surface. And so here's what we did. We put the tip in contact with the surface, and we start to ramp the voltage. And so you can see if we start here at 0 volts and we go one direction, we start to oxidize the surface, which raises the friction, right? And then we can start to ramp back the other way, right? And at some positive voltage, we start to remove the oxygen again. And then at some really high positive voltage, we start to do what we think is some hydrogenation of the surface. And then if we go back, we can start to remove that again. And there's a little bit of disparity here, which may be due to incomplete reversibility or due to some defects we might have imparted into the system, or maybe just noise in general. But we can pretty much do this in a fairly reversible manner, okay? And so there's a little bit more theory that goes into this, and I'm not going to go into the super high detail, but essentially, if you think about two potentials, that one you can twist, that you can slant by applying force, and the other you can linearly move potential wells by the application of voltage, you have down here this mouthful. So on the left in blue, this is just our energy barrier between the starting and final state, or starting and transition, right? This is our force function, right, which looks pretty similar. It's got an f² term in it, and then all of this other stuff is what people in electrochemistry call alpha, which roughly correlates to the relative slopes on either side of this reaction, because you have to balance both the forward and the reverse reaction here. Okay, so we have an equation to understand the effect of both force and voltage here. And so this is an example of us depositing oxygen onto the surface, and there's a lot here in this video. It's quite interesting. So you see at low voltages nothing happens, and then at some voltage we start to see significant reaction occurring, and then eventually it flattens out. What's really interesting here is that the reaction doesn't occur uniformly everywhere. Okay, and we're really excited by this because we do think that the structure of the surface should change the reactivity that we observe. As you can actually see down here at the bottom right, that this is a wrinkle on the surface, and this wrinkle actually starts to oxidize first before the flatter regions. Okay, and then you can kind of see that it starts to oxidize in the center and then sort of grows out a little bit from there. So it's quite apparent here that the local morphology of the surface matters. Okay, so we wanted to kind of look at that in a little bit more detail. Okay, so there's a lot going on here, but essentially all we did was we applied a voltage and we ran this reaction at different applied loads, right? So over here on the left is low load, right? And then as we move over to the right, the load gets higher. And what you see on the left is essentially this alpha term that I described before. And it's interesting because you can see that this alpha term varies quite dramatically between different regions. Okay, and you can kind of see that alpha here is 0.5, which is what most people in electrochemistry just assume if they don't know what it is, right? That the slopes on either side of this reaction curve are about equal, but then there were some regions where it was significantly lower, and that showed up here. You know, these regions where it's 0.5, the jump in the reaction was quite abrupt, but these regions where it was low, it was much more spread out. Okay, what's interesting as well is that as we apply a force to this system, the disparity between these sort of high alpha regions and low alpha regions starts to go away. And so you can see here that these two regions are sort of being smushed together. And then as we go to really high load, eventually we just get to that really low alpha term, right? So as we start to push more and more, we're bending this, we're biasing this to the forward reaction so hard that the heterogeneity of the surface no longer matters. So this is interesting. At low loads, right, the dominant variable here is the heterogeneity of the surface, or the changing morphology of the surface. And then at higher loads, the load overpowers all of those heterogeneities, and the reaction tends to proceed pretty uniformly on that surface. Okay, so the big takeaway here is that local morphology matters quite a lot. Another interesting takeaway that I want to leave here without delving too much into it is that we were actually, you know, as mechanical engineers, again, I'll self-deprecate a little bit. You know, we thought, well, if we're pushing on, you know, graphene oxide, the harder we push, the easier it is to remove oxygen molecules. Then the harder we push here, it should be harder to add oxygen molecules, right? Because that friction force would be competing with the forward reaction, right? We'd be adding and then removing as you go to higher loads. But we saw the exact opposite, of course, as we always do in science, is that as we applied more load, this reaction proceeded more strongly. And so there's a couple reasons why we think this might be the case, but suffice it to say, the interesting takeaway here is that we can measure that effect, right? And so we can see hey, if you push on this electrochemical reaction with an applied load, it drives it forward. Okay, so now I want to come back to one of the this will be the final deep dive topic that I want to discuss in this talk, and that is this idea of normal versus shear. And there's a lot going on in this slide, so let me go somewhat slowly here. We wanted to investigate exactly how these oxygen species were being removed from graphene with the tip, right? Because all I've done so far is I've showed you that I can measure the thermodynamics and the kinetics of moving from some initial state, which I know fairly well, through some transition state to a final state, which I don't know really at all, right? Sort of in the dark there, right? So what does this transition look like? Which forces are being applied here, and what's happening to these oxygen molecules after I've removed them, right? And so this was our attempt to try to answer some of these questions, and the framework that we came up to understand it is all based on forward and reverse reactions. And so if you think about it, we can break up what's going on with this system by saying that if I have an AFM tip near this graphene surface, and I have an oxygen molecule that's now interacting, that's bonded to the graphene, that's now interacting with the tip, there's going to be some rate at which it will be interacting with the tip, but also a rate at which it will hop away from the tip and not be interacting. And so we think about the equilibrium state as a balance between the on rate and the off rate. Okay, and here I've only showed a single oxygen atom or a single oxygen species, but really when you have this tip in contact with the surface, you're going to have an ensemble or a population of these things occurring. And so that's something that we have to keep in mind as well. And then as this tip is sliding, we can say it's applying a shear to this bond, right? And over the time in which it's actually attached and interacting with the tip. And we hypothesized that it was the shear that was moving the atom, the oxygen species. And what we kind of thought was, I don't know if we're actually really even getting it off the surface. We might just be pushing it out along the graphene surface. And so hopefully that's something that I will try to explain here very briefly without delving too much into the math. Without going too much into it, this is just a balance of the population of atoms that are interacting with the tip versus atoms that aren't interacting with the tip over time, right? And it's based on the rate at which ones that are not interacting start interacting, minus the rate at which ones that are interacting stop interacting, and then minus some rate of wear, rate of removal, right? And so these two are pretty strongly linked. And then we show this rate of removal, and it's sort of the and this hyperbolic sign, don't get scared by it. It's just incorporating the forward and reverse together. You have a positive exponential, a negative exponential. You can lump those together into a hyperbolic function. And so this kind of looks like it's somewhat unlinked to this, right? But actually the way that it gets linked, if you look at this term here, S is sort of the strength of the spring of this reaction. U is the speed of the tip. Tau is the time over which this reaction is occurring, or this interaction is occurring. And then lambda is just some length scale, which is generally the lattice of the graphene if we think that it's hopping along the graphene lattice. The way that this is linked is through time, the time of the bonding event to the tip, okay? And that is dictated by this equation here, okay? So all of these equations are linked together. And so what we wanted to figure out was, can we evaluate, what is this energy barrier to removal, which is the reaction that we're interested in, as a function of speed, okay? Because if it is a function of speed, then we're showing that this is primarily driven the wear reaction is primarily driven by stress, but the bonding reaction is driven by normal load. And so in that sense, we can almost look at how normal load and shear load work together, but in independent ways to drive this reaction. Okay, so hopefully that made sense in the very short time that I just spent explaining it. Okay, so data overload. If we look over on the left, what is this? We're looking using our tool to look at the drop in friction on this graphene surface, which tells us the rate, how much oxygen we've removed from the surface. But now, instead of doing it as a function of temperature or as a function of force, we're doing it as a function of tip velocity, okay? And we do this at a bunch of different forces. So each color is a different force, okay? So we start at low velocity and then we ramp the velocity until we have removed just about everything that we think we're going to remove, okay? And if you look here, this dark red curve is at a low force, 15 nanonewtons is relatively low for us. And what we saw, we were quite excited to see this. We did not expect to see something quite this dramatic. At low velocities, nothing happens, right? And it's only until we get to a certain velocity that we start to see a significant removal of oxygen atoms. And then that proceeds until we pretty much removed everything. Things start to rip out here, right? So, and then the next interesting thing to describe here is that as we increase the force, the velocity required to drive this reaction goes down, okay? And eventually we get to the point where we're applying so much load that any velocity will let it run. And so we can fit this, and this was actually quite a Herculean effort. We had to do a regression analysis on a numerical solution to a differential equation that didn't have a explicit analytical solution. So this took, I think, a day of calculation just to get these curves to fit. What's interesting is we can fit things like the stiffness of that interaction between the tip and the surface, and we can fit the energy barrier over which we can move it across the surface. Okay, and the energy barrier starts at low loads around 0.8 eV, which again, 0.7, 0.8 eV, which again matches fairly well with our other investigations of the surface. And then as we apply more load, this energy barrier drops, okay? And what's also interesting too is the stiffness for low forces. The stiffness is relatively constant, but then at some point it starts to get pretty stiff, right? And so some strong nonlinearity there in how hard you push on the system and how stiff it becomes. But we thought that was interesting as well. And so what this allows us to do is then understand that the shear is very important in this process, right? So as you push harder with the tip is spending more time bonded to the oxygen species is spending more time bonded to the tip. So now when I'm sliding, the longer it's bonded to the tip, the more I can pull on it before it hops off again. Right, so the higher probability that I'm going to drive this reaction on the surface, and it's interesting because you look at the energy barriers and they're quite high, and so you would expect relatively high. So you'd expect the forces required for something like this to just break a bond permanently. Typically in mechanochemical reactions, it's on the order of a nanonewton, half a nanonewton to a nanonewton, and here we're looking at almost 1,000 times less than that, 100 to 1,000 times less than that. And so the amount of force that we're applying to each atom is quite small. And so this supports this idea that what we're really doing is the energy barrier that is resisting the removal of these oxygen species is actually the energy barrier to hopping on the surface. And so we do think that the primary pathway for this reaction could be because we are simply assisting the diffusion of the atoms away from the point at which we are scanning. So there's, I hope that I've convinced you that we can use the atomic force microscope to measure a whole host of interesting things experimentally and quantitatively about mechanochemical reactivity on surfaces. And so now, just to very briefly summarize, I hate summary slides, but very briefly summarize, we talked about how we can use atomic force microscopy to measure quantitative things about chemical reactions and surfaces as a function of temperature, force, and other external fields, and we can break those components down to quite intricate levels. And now I just want to spend a few minutes here in the last little bit of time talking about where I think this could be going, because I think this is an important part of the mechanochemical community to have this discussion and try to bring some of this quantitative value that we've started developing at the nanoscale, sort of right at that interface between atomic level information and nanoscale, mesoscale sort of ensemble information. How do we take that and drag it all the way up to the gram scale so that we can start doing things like predicting what reaction rates are going to be, what our yields are going to be, if we have a reaction that has multiple pathways, how we can tune the forces and the reaction knobs that we have available so that we can selectively drive one or the other, right? That would be a huge thing if we could do that. And again, you think about shear versus normal load. If one reaction reacts better to shear than normal load, if you apply more shear, maybe you could drive it, right? So the more we understand and the more that we can control the forces that are occurring at larger scales, I think the more we'll be able to move this field to making all sorts of cool things. So very briefly, where do we go from here? There's lots of challenges in here that maybe, as a mechanical engineer, I would think maybe a chemist, wouldn't have spent a whole lot of time thinking about yet. And I hope that my unique perspective will provide some value to this community. But one of the big things and very complicated things is that when you have these collisions that are occurring at larger scales, right? Balls just moving around in a mill and smashing things. The balls are smashing particulates, right? And particulates are smashing against other particulates. And so there's interfaces between the particulates, which you kind of see here at the nanoscale and mesoscale, right? And interfaces between the particulates and, the ball, the thing that's smashing them, right? And so, how do you understand, how those forces that are being applied in this very complex system are driving things? And also another thing that I think is under considered is these particles are also fracturing as you're smashing them. And so the reactivity of the system should be going up over time as you're increasing surface area, as your particles get smaller. And so how do we incorporate all those things? One idea I've been kicking around is, the techniques that we've been applying here for a very simple chemical system could easily be applied to much more interesting synthetic systems. So for example, there's a whole lot of work in the mechanochemistry community that's looking at taking two reactants, right? And they typically are in dry form, so they form some sort of crystalline packing structure, and they smash them together. And it's fairly chaotic, but it doesn't need to be chaotic, right? What if we just took two of these things and rubbed them together in this very sensitive force system and measured maybe not friction, but was able to interrogate changes in these systems as a function of force and temperature and crystallographic orientation. And crystallographic orientation is important because that starts to give us some of the variability in the system, right? So everybody always asks, well, you're doing all these very nice experiments at the nanoscale with this very well-defined system, but in a real system, everything's going to be at different angles. You're going to be smashing things in different ways. How do you untangle that? Well, if you know the reactivity is a function of orientation, and what the distribution of orientation, the crystallographic faces in your system and how they evolve, you could come up with some average, right, over time. And so this I think is an interesting area to spend some time in. I know I'm running out of time. I promise I'm almost done. And I mentioned this very briefly, but I think another thing that needs to be considered is that these particles are fracturing. these particles are interacting with each other in very complex ways. And the system with which we are smashing these particles is also very complex. And so understanding how the forces evolve inside of these larger reactors is going to be critical, and understanding how the free surface reactivity evolves is also critical. And then there's another interesting thing I put down here. Most of the things that you're working with, that the community works with, fairly brittle crystals. But there are a lot of situations where even brittle crystals can become plastic, and they can flow. And so there are interesting studies showing that if you smash two different plastic things together, they will almost, in a mechanochemical mill, they'll almost knead together. Like if you've ever made biscuits, and you layer them, right? They become layered, and you get this lamellar structure inside. And so, there's all sorts of interesting mechanics and morphology issues that come up here that I think could be explored as well. And then finally, one of the things that my group and the center here is working on is trying to bring some of the force control that we've been able to exploit at the nanoscale up to the macro scale, so that we can take this very chaotic milligram or gram scale synthetic system to something that is less chaotic. And so here is a system that we've recently developed and are continuing to work on, where it's essentially a ball mill where every impact inside of the mill, the force is controlled and measured. And so you can look at how the forces evolve in the system over time, and you can correlate that to the reactivity. And so hopefully, very soon we'll be able to show some interesting work on the reactivity of and the effect of force inside of these ball mills. And I think that's where the community can also gain a lot by trying to make the systems more mechanically controlled and quantified. I think will ultimately lead to great leaps in control over reactivity, yields, and selectivity. So with that, I'm about out of time. I would like to thank the collaborators, and in particular my students as well, who did a lot of this work, and who really helped turn something that is very special to me into something that's special to a lot of other people. So I'd also like to thank a variety of funding sources, and I specifically want to thank the NSF and the Center for the Mechanical Control of Chemistry, of which I'm a part, for bringing light and bringing attention to the world of mechanochemistry in the North America, or in the Americas, which is so needed as other parts of the world have started pursuing this in great detail. So with that, thank you very much, and I'll take any questions anybody has.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Feltz. We have a few questions. Let's start with this one in YouTube. Is there any issue with thermal drift with the heated AFM tips?
Tons, yes. I mean, there's all sorts of problems with thermal. I mean, there's issues with thermal drift even without the heat tips. Okay, and actually, one of the primary challenges in all of these experiments is that some of these experiments take a lot of time. And so, how do you counteract thermal drift? The primary way we counteract thermal drift in general is we set everything up and we wait a day, and then we do the measurement. In a very controlled environment as best we can. But even then, over the course of maybe half a day, the system might drift 20 to 40 nanometers, and if it drifts more than that, we had to stop the experiment and do it again. With the heated AFM tips, it's not quite so bad because the thermal time constant of those tips is small, and the total area over which it warms things is fairly small. So that drift tends to go away much sooner than the drift of the entire system.
All right, thank you. Next question here. At one point you mentioned that a reaction happened first at a wrinkle on the graphene. First, how did you know it was a wrinkle? And second, why does the reaction start first there?
This is a good question. everything I'm about to say is somewhat speculative, right? So, I mean, I think that's important in science, as we know the limits of, or the confidence in the things that we say. Um, the reason we know it's a wrinkle is because we've imaged more graphene than probably any human being ever should. And the height profile and the way that it was a single graphene flake, right? So it wasn't just two flakes over top of each other, right? And so the only way that you could have a ridge like that in a single graphene flake is if it had buckled and fallen over. And so so we're pretty confident in that. Now, why did the reaction occur there first? I think a lot of it has to do, if you think back to one of the earliest slides I showed you, is that if you apply force to make the reactants look like the activation state, you will drive that reaction forward. Well, it doesn't have to just be force. It could also be strain in the geometry, right? So if you think about how graphene's actually quite chemically stable because it's flat, right? sp2 flat. If you want to make it sp3, you've got to buckle it out of plane. You've got to pull it up out of plane, right? And it really doesn't want to do that. It takes a lot of work to do that. And so, but if you have something that's curved, right, it's already sort of doing that on its own, right? And so we think the reason for the increased reactivity is that curvature just helps it start to look more like sp3 before you start. I hope that's clear. If it's not, you can follow up. So the curvature increases reactivity of graphene.
Thank you. Here's another question. Have you seen evidence of inhomogeneity across probed regions, suggesting that a reaction at a site affects reaction rates at nearby sites?
That has been more difficult. We have thought about this and looked for it. One of the experiments we did, I don't know if it's in the supporting information of the nanoletters paper. I talked the thermochemical work. One of the things we were interested in, we've been looking for this possibility of diffusion on the surface for a long time. So one of the things we did was we thermally removed something on the surface, and then just a line. We removed the oxygen, and then we would sit there and scan and look, and we would raise the temperature and look and see if we could see atoms then now moving back into that space over time, and we didn't see anything like that. And so, back to your question of, do neighboring sites affect, at least for these reactions, do neighboring sites affect the reactivity of a specific site? I don't think so. If I had to pick one, right? I don't think so. And the primary reason is because, number one, these reactions, they tend to be fairly well fit with first order and not anything else. So that would suggest that it's not a larger effect. And then number two, if you think back to like that activation volume, which is the number of atoms that are changing volume, the ones that we're measuring, at least, within the confidence intervals, tend to be pretty small. And if it was a larger interaction that was occurring, I would expect those numbers to be larger. So again, hard to say, but probably not here.
All righty, let's squeeze in one last question. Early in the presentation, you mentioned that you could terminate the graphene with both oxygen and other species. Have you found if there's different friction with different termination? And if so, could you use that as a way to differentiate normal and shear effects?
Yeah, so it's a lot of that work looking at other species was done a long time ago during my time when I was at the Naval Research Lab, and they had some great folks there who were really good at gently applying a plasma to 2D materials without destroying them, and so they were able to put all sorts of things on there. There's certainly a ton of questions you could continue to ask there. One thing I didn't show that we did look at for those systems, though, is that the forces required to remove those bonds were notably different, right? So we were able to distinguish relatively, not quantitatively at that point, because we weren't really using temperature and our methods were still being developed. But we were able to determine qualitatively or relatively that the different bonds had different bond strengths and required different forces to be removed. We also looked at different tip materials to see if there was some effect on the tip material as well. And there was some preliminary evidence that perhaps carbon tips lowered the barrier more than silicon-based tips. That work, certainly more work would need to be done there to verify that. But trying to investigate normal load versus shear load, utilizing the different types of molecules, I'm not exactly sure in my mind how that logically would be set up. But like I said, looking at how they're different could tell us all sorts of things that has been largely unexplored since we originally did that work. So lots of possibilities there.
All right, well, thank you again for that excellent presentation, and thank you for being part of the seminar series.
All right, thanks everybody.
Thank you again, Dr. Felts, for that outstanding presentation, and thank you so much for joining us. Just a reminder, we've had quite a few excellent speakers as part of the seminar series, and we encourage you to check them out, available on the YouTube channel. Also, we have an excellent slate of speakers lined up for the remainder of this year, and we hope that you will join us for